Okay, we are now recording. Welcome all. I'm delighted to be able to introduce Ezequiel Di Paolo to the group. I want to be able to say that Ezequiel has a beautiful mind. But since he's rejecting Cartesian dualism, I have to say he has a beautiful, enactive, embodied, and embedded spirit, something like that. I can't just talk about the mind, if you will. I encountered Ezequiel's work several years ago, and the first piece that I saw was something that he had written on sensory motor intelligence. And sensory motor intelligence for me was so important because it harks back to Piaget's foundational constructivist work. And I found the analysis to be so remarkably rich in connecting to other approaches that I just wanted to read more and more. So if you will, I'm just going to show you a couple of the book covers here to show you the depth and breadth of Ezequiel's work. So here's one here, an action, where he's basically talking about the basics of an enactivist approach as a new paradigm. And then here's the book that the idea is that it really had an effect on me, the sensory motor life, the idea that we are embodied beings and we are active beings, that it is through our actions in our bodies on the world that we create ourselves. You know, we self-individuate is this idea, an idea that I thought that was really quite foundational, important. And then as I looked still further, well, there was always more. There was always, we have this foundational embodiment and activity and self-individuation, but well, it's related to the world, it's related to the ecology. Even though that we are separate beings, we are nonetheless fully embedded and coupled with our ecological environments. But that wasn't enough. There's also robots. Okay, so that there's parallelisms between our inactive way of being in the world and what we can learn from robots if we take an evolutionary or embodied or organic view of artificial intelligence. And then, which leads us to linguistic bodies, an embodied, what could be further apart and ridiculous than language and body? But it's not, right? I mean, it is through the language that we live, and it's through language that we're able to represent the body and regulate our actions within sociocultural context, etc. And so this is good stuff for me. And I'll just say the following. I remember being in a conference several years ago, and it was at the Piaget Society, I believe, and I just got finished with one symposium that I was looking at on dynamic systems theory, which I thought was really important and really integrative, but I left there feeling just empty. And then I went into the symposium on enactivism, which was very similar in so many different ways, but added this dimension that might be called, hey, human experience. And I was able to see my own experience, the experience of a person within the context of the larger systemic, philosophical, theoretical material. And boy, that sold me. So that's why I think it's important that Ezequiel has some important things to say to us. So without further whatever, I hate that phrase. Let's hear what, let's turn it over to Ezequiel. Sir.
Well, thank you very much, Mike. And thanks, Mike and Harry, for the invite. I will share my screen while I start talking a bit. Can you see that?
Yes.
Yes.
Okay. So I was mentioning earlier that it is not easy for me to try to condense the main ideas of the enactive approach, partly because well, it is a name of an evolving and developing set of ideas. Partly because, I mean, you mentioned dynamical systems. That's one of the sources of this way of thinking, also phenomenology, psychology, ecological psychology, and so on. And so sometimes it's difficult to adapt the content of the presentation. Sometimes it becomes too technical, and it's not that interesting if you're not already into it. So I decided that given the context of this seminar series, I thought that agency might be a sort of bridge, a sort of connection that the listeners might feel that there is some way of grasping some of the ideas of an active approach and maybe project them and connect them to their work. And because certainly the agency is important in personal construct theory, on which, as I say again, I'm not an expert. So that doesn't mean that maybe if you have a particular question that is not covering what I'm saying, a topic that we can talk about it, of course, later. So I will present a little bit this idea of the concept of agency, and because it's a thread that connects several of the topics. And I will talk about minimal agency, sensorimotor agency, and linguistic agency towards the end. So a little bit, I mean, the enactive approach, I mean, I also have some book covers. The enactive approach, as I said, is an evolving set of ideas. There are diverse people looking into questions of philosophy, questions of psychology. It all starts with this name, let's put it this way, in 1991 with the publication of Embodied Mind by Francisco Varela, Evan Thompson, and Eleanor Roche. But over the last few years, we've seen several new books coming out and lots of papers, of course. And there's a recent one by Saneka Dehan down at the bottom on enactive psychiatry that is very interesting. So that we can see how the core of ideas are beginning to be developed into applied and different, applied to different domains. And this is, I think, an interesting and exciting time. I'm not going to be talking about applications, but there are many. We have seen applications of enactive ideas to education science, to mental health, to literature studies and readings, to the arts, performance arts in particular, to the design of interfaces for communications, to psychotherapy, and so on. But I'm not going to be specifically talking about these applications directly. So I can focus on presenting some of these core ideas, the idea of agency in particular. One overarching idea of an active perspective that you probably will hear as soon as you open any book or paper on an active approach is this idea of the continuity between life and mind. Out of the many influences of an active approach, we have a particular view on the organization of living systems that comes from theories like Maturana and Varela's autopoiesis, the theory of autopoiesis, and has continued to evolve even to recent times in theories of organizational approaches in biology. And the life-mind continuity, the mind part, we're not trying to reduce mind to life, but what we want to say is that the sort of ideas, the sort of concepts, and the kind of phenomena that belongs to living systems is already the sort of phenomena that you will also find in mindful systems or minded systems. I think this will become clear because it's not so much like a strict dogma or anything, but it's a way of intuiting these connections between, in a non-dualistic way, between organic processes, psychological processes, social processes, and so on. So that's a bit of a background. So the enactive approach, as I was saying, combines several sources. It has a deep influence from phenomenology, especially the phenomenology of Maurice Merleau-Ponty, for instance, but others as well. It has systemic roots in dynamical systems theory, and prior to that in cybernetics and organizational approaches to biology. And of course, is part of the now so-called 4E embodied cognition approaches, 4E, well, the E's vary, but these things are embodied, enacted, ecological, embedded, something like this. It sort of is evolving, as I was saying, but something that you will find is that we tend to favor a relational ontology, a way of looking at the world in terms of processes. And something that has become more and more recent and important, more important in recent times, is this idea of historicity, that these processes are about change over time. One of the slogans of an active approach that Varela used was the one about laying down the path in walking, which comes from a poem by Antonio Machado, which is a kind of way of looking at the organism in relation to its world, not as a passive entity that just receives whatever information comes into the world, but as a participant in the world. The agent is doing things together with other agents, and therefore what matters to these agents is partly also a consequence of their own history and their own activity. Another way to put that is with this idea of a co-definition between organism and environment in a history of mutual shaping. One of the main ideas is the idea of sense-making, which I'm going to talk about. And we claim that sense-making is, if you like, the umbrella term that covers all kinds of minded phenomena. For instance, without distinctions between cognition, emotion, action, perception, they all have something in common, and this is sense-making. And we will try to make that clear in a moment. And that life, all life, is able to do this sense-making. So there's a continuity, of course, with difference across the different kinds of life, the forms of life. But this difference always conserves a basic core of what we call sense-making, which in a nutshell is caring. You are an entity that is capable of caring about what's happening around you and what's happening to yourself and others. And something that is important since the beginning is also the social dimension. And in particular, we'll be talking a bit about participatory sense-making and what happens in the course of an interaction between agents. So I will be talking, yes, we'll be saying this mostly about stuff that was published in this book in 2017, Sensorimotor Life. I will be mentioning linguistic bodies because, you know, it seems that some people want to discuss that too, but towards the end. So let's now step back and try to work out what sort of approach to agency would come out of these things I've been saying about the relational ontology, the history, and so on. Well, we know that agency is a concept that is used a lot in psychology. Eleanor Gibson, in one of her last addresses, when she was asking the question, has psychology got a future in the mid-90s, was saying that agency is the hallmark of human behavior, but that she was thinking that psychology was not really trying to understand this directly. I mean, agency is one of those words that we kind of settle on a common meaning without investigating it, without opening up what it actually means. I mean, I'm not saying everybody does this, but often that's how it's used. She proposed something that is about the control of events, and proposes also that it has different parts, such as projecting towards the future, conserving part of the past, and so on and so forth. Another ecological psychologist, Edward Reed, said again that this is a central problem of psychology, how people put themselves in motion. And for him, it was not a purely mechanistic problem, or could not be explained in purely mechanistic terms. And in psychology, we do find different approaches and discussions about agency. Mostly it is understood as a capacity. something that a system has as a capacity in terms of the possibilities of what it can do. The capacity in particular of self-determining the action and the activity in the right context. Most of the time, this is applied to human agency too. So we wanted to start, when we started thinking about this, colleagues and me, we were wanting to look at, if you like, the philosophical core of the idea of agency. What is it? What are we talking about? I mean, when do we find ourselves comfortable ascribing agency to a system and when it doesn't make sense? So in 2009, we wrote a paper called Defining Agency, where we went through many uses of the term agency in psychology and philosophy. And we always discover some commonalities that seem to be either explicitly or implicitly entailed. And these commonalities we narrow down to three requirements, three basic conditions that seem to always be the case, as far as we can tell, whenever we're talking about agency. One is the idea of individuality, or self-individuation. There is a nuance there in the word, but it doesn't matter. It's individuality. We tend to think of the agent as a system, an individual, a person, an animal. Diffuse agencies are harder to conceptualize and seem to be, in any case, derivative of this original idea of agency coming from an individual. The agent always engages its surroundings as, you know, as the origin of some action or some change. So we call that interactional asymmetry. That is to say, the symmetry between agent and environment is not the same, is broken when the agent acts, as opposed to the symmetry between two other any systems that have some coupling between them. Well, in the case of agents, they do engage in this sometimes, not all the time, breaking that symmetry. They act in the world. That would be the simplest way to put it. And these engagements are normative. They follow, they're not random. They follow some goal, some expectations, some the fulfillment of some need, and so on. It could be something like biological, organic need for food, shelter, or some other higher order or more complex form of condition of satisfaction or none. We will come back to that. So I will briefly try to show you how we go through these requirements in terms of the existing concepts of the enactive approach. So starting with the first one, self-individuation. This is coming from the theory of autopoiesis and Maturana and Varela that you may have heard of. And what I'm going to describe here is the idea of autonomy, which is a derivative concept of autopoiesis applied to more general systems. And what characterizes autonomous systems is a systemic relation called operational closure. I will try to describe it using this diagram. So imagine that you're in a lab and you're measuring different processes, temperature of this, the movement of that, a chemical reaction, whatever. And these things you're measuring are these blobs. All these color things are things that you are monitoring, maybe intervening with, and so on. And whenever you intervene with any of these processes, you observe the implications that that intervention has for other processes. And then you draw an arrow. If I change the concentration of this chemical, the temperature goes up. Okay, maybe I start drawing arrows among all my observations. And if these arrows are relations of enablement, in the sense that I need this process in order for that one to happen, well, I start mapping all those relations of enablement. And it may be that you don't see anything, but it may be that you end up having a structure like the one I'm showing here, which is, if you notice, all the yellow processes have both outgoing and incoming arrows to other yellow processes. So these form a network. a network of self-enabling processes or mutually enabling processes. This does not mean that the system is disconnected from the outside. As you can see, there are arrows that come from the outside, from the environment, into processes in that system, and outgoing arrows too. But the basic idea of an autonomous system or an operationally closed system is this one: a series of processes that are sustained mutually through a network, a closed network of enablement. And there are further specifications, such as these processes must be precarious, but maybe we don't need to go into that right now. So this forms an individual. If you want to, we can say, okay, it's not just me ascribing individuality to this system. This is, I am, as an observer, involved, no, undoubtedly, because I'm choosing what to observe and what to look at. But once I've chosen that, I can see that the arrows form a closed network. And that's an observation I cannot deny. So in a way, it's my observation, something is popping up and saying, I am the system here. So when we talk about individuality and self-individuation, we mean these. And the classical case is life. Living systems are autopoietic, are self-producing. Normally, we use this sort of icon there to describe them as a loop that is self-enabling. In this case, will be the loop of metabolism and the structures of a living cell, for instance. And some wavy lines down there to signify the environment, so that there are mutual relations with environment. Now, Francisco Varela, as I said, is one of the major figures in the enactive approach. And towards the end of his life, he proposed something very interesting, which was, if you consider this system, which is self-sustaining, self-maintaining, can we just say that this is a natural purpose in the Kantian sense of the term? That is to say, a system that is both means and ends of itself. And if so, can that be used to ground a concept like sense making, which is to say that that organism already entails, by its very organization, a relation to the world in terms of meaning. Even if meaning is too high a word, maybe we have to pick the right word. But in terms of what we might call biological norms, biological values or valences, and so on and so forth, can this be grounded on the idea of the organization of the autopoietic system? And this is a wonderful proposal. And what I discussed, when I discussed in 2005 this proposal, I said, not quite. We need to go a little bit deeper into what's going on here. So, and I proposed that what you need is this individuality plus something else. And that's something else I call adaptivity. I will say what it is in a second. Now, if you have a system that is self-sustaining, but also is able to engage the world in terms of the possibilities afforded by the interactions, or in terms of the risks that interaction entails before the system is dead, before something fatal happens, well, that system would be a sense maker. If you only use autopoiesis, what you have is an on-off switch. Either the system is alive or it isn't. So we need to try to have a more fine-tuned concept, and that was the concept of adaptivity. Now, what is this concept of adaptivity? So I showed that organization, that system. I said that these are precarious processes. It could be a living cell when you have processes of chemical reactions, biochemical reactions, metabolism, DNA, a membrane that is being constantly repaired and allows things to pass through, and so on and so forth. So those conditions, in systemic terms, define a boundary of viability. That is to say, in some states, that system will continue to function and produce itself, but in other states, it will just simply disappear. It will just dissolve. If you break the boundary the chemicals will just fly off. That's not exactly true, but that's okay. Never mind. We can come back to that. So there are fatal conditions, and if your current state is about to cross that boundary of viability, the way it's depicted here with this arrow, so you cross it, well, there is no longer any system. That organization disappeared. So adaptivity is the idea that in some cases, the system is able to regulate this potential crossing before it happens. And that may fail, and that may not happen to every possible dangerous situation that the system encounters. But if it is able to do this, now we have that idea of normativity coming into the picture. Normativity in the broadest possible sense. Please do not think only of human normativity, social normativity. I mean, normativity in the sense of vital norms, like philosophers like George Canguilhem or Merleau-Ponty talk about. That normativity is grounded on this systemic possibility of adapting according to some norm in such a way that your viability is conserved or tends to be conserved. So that's where the norms come from. And the interactive asymmetry, basically, forget the maths on the side. It's essentially, you may have a system and its environment, X and E, meant to represent a couple system. Like here, we had the circle, and the wavy lines being the environment. These two are coupled, and this is a symmetrical situation. You see there's an arrow coming up and an arrow coming down. That's what the symmetry is. If the system is able sometimes, on occasions, not always, to change the constraints of that relation, to change the parameters, to change how that interaction is unfolding, what is shown here with these red arrows, then you have an agent. So the interaction asymmetry is like a second order regulation. It's a regulation of an already coupled system with its environment. Like, I change the position of the glass with water such that it comes close to my mouth and now I can drink. So I just regulated that an interaction with the environment, a parameter of my relation to the environment, things like this. So these are the basic ideas and requirements of this notion of agency. Individuation, normativity, and asymmetry. And in the book, we have these Venn diagrams that are meant to be illustrate a little bit this concept with examples down there of systems that would fulfill one condition or another, or a combination of two or the three. At the intersection of the three, we have an example, which is bacteria doing metabolic chemotaxis. That's a clear example of agency according to this definition. Why? Because it fulfills the requirement of individuation. The bacteria is self-making. It changes its relation to the gradients of sugar or whatever chemical according to a norm. So it's asymmetrical and normative. But then you may have other systems that are self-individuating, like a tornado or a candle flame or a crystal, that are not following necessarily any norms, they just are, or systems that are normative, but they're like, a piece of technology like a toaster has to function, it has to fulfill a role and so on, but it's not self-individuating, it's not making itself, and so on. Whenever we get into discussing these examples, there's always a controversy, because sometimes say, what about candle flame that is self-sustaining? And well, we could go into that, and it might be that in one example might switch from one area on the diagram to another. That's fine. Now, so this is the core of the idea of agency, and it kind of connects to what Edward Reed was saying when he was claiming that this is the main question in psychology, is a question of agency. He says behavior. I mean, it's a different word, but we're talking about the same thing. It's defined as an animal's ability to change its relationship with its surroundings. This is very much the idea of asymmetry, changing the relationship. Now, You might think that this means that then agents are engaged all the time in being very active and doing stuff, otherwise they cease to be agents. That's not what we mean. An agent, the regulation does not entail that the source of the process has to come from the body of the agent. So for instance, here we have this bird, the kestrel, hovering above ground, looking for prey, and is staying on the spot. So you might think, oh, it's not changing much. Well, actually, it is precisely using the energy flows of the wind and using the light and using and maintaining a particular situation of equilibrium that allows it to follow certain vital norms, like finding food. So agency doesn't mean that you are all the time moving about and changing the world. You can use the world to your advantage in this case by regulating the flows around your body. So I just want to separate a little bit the idea of agency from the idea of activity and passivity. I mean, you can be an agent and be passive. And even though agency, its hallmark is manifested in activity, that doesn't mean that you cease to be an agent when you're passive. And with a couple of colleagues, we discussed this in a recent paper where we look at the work of Richard Held, the neuroscientist, the one of the famous blind kitten experiment. And discussed that, in fact, activity and passivity are not well-defined terms, that they imply there are multiple dimensions of activity and passivity. You might be controlling your movement, you might be monitoring your movement, you might be deciding to initiate your movements. These are all different dimensions of activity. I may decide to do something and then somebody else takes control. I may monitor what I'm doing, but somebody else is moving my hand. Or I may passively allow somebody to move my hands, and this letting them do it is active, and so on. So activity and passivity should be kept as a dimensions, more than one, of agency. And also, sometimes agency and individuation become a little bit confused and intertwined. So here we have an examples of these insects that can go underwater. They trap air bubbles in the hairs of the abdomen. And these air bubbles are sustained there. They don't evaporate because they're very small, and the surface tension it keeps them there. And they use these bubbles as oxygen exchange. They exchange the oxygen from the water into the bubble, and then they can breathe underwater. Same with the spider, the diving bell spider, I think it's called. So they can spend hours or potentially indefinite time underwater. So you might ask, well, is this an example of an agent who's changing its relation to its environment? Yes, absolutely it is. But perhaps it's something more, because now there are some interesting complex dependencies here that are arising from this interaction, because a vital norm such as breathing is now allowed in a new medium. It's almost as if we had that diagram that I've shown before of showing how the system is a network of processes that is self-individuating, and suddenly an external process was added. In this case, let's use bubbles to make an artificial gill, so to, that I can go underwater. So this is an important example, because one of the things I will be claiming is that our actions and our acts end up constituting and reconstituting our bodies all the time. So it's not that we have that once and for all defined individual that then acts in the world. The acts on the world are constantly being reabsorbed into the very definition of its individuality. And we will see that when we look at sensorimotor agency in a minute. So this is what I just said. Normally we think that the constitution of the individual must be prior to the interaction. Yeah, because you have to have a system that will interact with something. You have to have it beforehand. Well, it seems that these two may be historically mutually co-defining them, one each other. Now, I want to move on to a little bit to what we discuss in the book Sensorimotor Life. And it takes from the thing I just said, because, well, you know, I have the individuality of the organism. That's clearly a case of autopoiesis, self-production. But that would imply that the norms of the viability that I care about is only this organic viability. And that's not the case. We know it's not the case. Sometimes we care about things that are nothing to do directly with our biology. And so we need to, something is missing. And what is missing is a sensory motor sense of agency. But you might ask, well, but what is that system that is self-individuating? What is it made of? Well, in this book, we propose that it is the acts themselves, the sensorimotor schemes form networks of self-sustaining relations, and that is our sensorimotor body. I'll come to that right now. But as you say in this quote, it's a case of explaining who you are by referring to what you do, and explaining what you do by referring to who you are. Now, here we've got a typical sensorimotor scheme, typical Piagetian diagram, and we followed Piaget's equilibration theory here, and we give it a dynamical systems expression, and combine it with the rest of the enactive concept. So I don't need to explain much about this. What we have is that each of these arcs is a sensorimotor coordination, that each sensorimotor coordination is a coupling between environmental and bodily variables or processes, such in this case, the infant drinking from the bottle. You've got, you know, I don't know, breathing, you have air, and the breathing support, which is the muscles of the diaphragm, the lungs, and so on. And that each coordination of this scheme must give rise to the next stage in the cycle. In this case, it is a cycle. It doesn't always have to be, such that overall the combination, the right combination of this sensorimotor coordinations gives rise to the sensorimotor scheme. Now, the scheme, we often look at it this way. Oh, it's a cycle like this. In fact, every one of these coordinations has implications outside the cycle. They have implications for the environment. They have implications for the rest of the body. So some of these implications are totally irrelevant. They don't mean much. Say, when I'm swallowing, I make a noise, and maybe that noise is not particularly important for the task of drinking the milk, but it is, there is more to the sensorimotor coordination than the specific scheme. Okay.
Excuse me, I'll just mute that.
Yeah, sorry, it's okay. Sorry, I thought the microphone was probably on. So coming back to this idea of a scheme, some of the structural implications might relate to the conditions of other sensorimotor coordination in the same scheme or in other schemes. I don't know, I can work and I can arrange my workspace either consciously, or I can just simply work, and the workspace is sort of arranging itself by my actual doing of my work. And this is a case in which a certain pattern becomes more likely to be reenacted. Hold on, something wrong there. And of course, there may be that a particular sort of sensorimotor scheme has implications for other sensorimotor schemes. It helps them, it promotes them, such as, or maybe there are associations, or maybe one sensorimotor coordination is the path towards the next changing scheme, and so on. So we propose that, in fact, what we have are these networks of sensorimotor schemes. They're not isolated. It's not that I just do the one thing. I do all kinds of things. And they may be clustered into different areas of my life. Like I'm sitting at my desk, I have a certain pattern of sensorimotor schemes. If I'm on a bus, I have another set of patterns and so on. And this is an interesting thing because this network representation allows us to think that when a particular scheme is active, like in this case, this red one, it immediately subtends a network of priming, if you want to call it, or inhibitions, but it's not isolated, it's connected to other sensorimotor schemes that are either to be enacted immediately after, or are possibilities for immediate inaction, or are to be inhibited. You cannot just do the two things at the same time, or and so on. So we typically think of this isolated act like, say, pushing a button. You know, typically in psychology, you're always pushing buttons. Now, there are different situations in which you push buttons, and they're not the same. And the actual kinematics and dynamics of the muscles is different. If you on the lift, pushing a button for the floor you want to go to, if you're pushing an emergency button, or if you're controlling a crane, these are different activities. And they, in a way, must also carry in the actual moment of the enactment some connection to this broader set of activities. And in fact, you can tell that what I'm saying must be true, because if you look at the photo in the middle, it's suspicious. You never really push an alarm button like this. You know, if you're in an alarm situation, you don't just pose your finger very nicely so that the camera can focus on it. So that tells you a little bit about, like, there's something not quite right about that photo if you think it doesn't look realistic. And that is missing is, if you like, our sensitivity to that broader context of that action that is already present in the action itself. So if you have this idea of a network of sensorimotor schemes that are associated with different activities, what you might say is that there are local autonomous, operationally close relations all around this. By that I mean, for instance, a habit or a series of habits. Habits are self-sustained. They are in a way defining themselves such that you are more likely to enact them, or changing the conditions in the world such you're more likely to enact them. So we call these like micro-worlds or regional identities, but essentially is what I was just saying. If you're doing gardening, there are a series of norms and actions that make sense that are not the same as if you're driving a car. So that's the idea. But notice that the network does not entail a sort of a mechanistic or programmatic way in which the activities must happen. In fact, there may be still all sort of different kinds of variability in how these activities that belong to a cluster are enacted. But what we suggest is that at this level, we have those three requirements again. This is what we're suggesting. And so you have a sensorimotor agent made of this structure, this repertoire of activities. And that is why, in the case of a habit, is very clear. Now, say, I want to illustrate here people smoking or lighting up a cigarette, and the variability in which this is done does not discard the fact that this is an activity that is normative, that you do certain things with certain moves, with certain order. You know, you don't light the match and throw it out before lighting the cigarette, and so on and so forth. But this picture, I shall show you, allows for this possibility that today I do it like this, tomorrow in another situation, particularly social situation, I would do it in a different way. And yet it is still that self-sustaining set of network of schemes. So we go through this minimal agent idea that you can imagine bacteria would be the paradigmatic case, to something that in the icon, I would like to say that the regulation, the red arrow, closes on itself. I am regulating my actions, not just to sustain my organic body, but also to continue to be the kind of person who regulates actions in this way, continuing to be, you know, a bundle of habits, to use James' phrase. So that's the shift. We still have the three requirements, but just appear at a new level. That's not the right word. In a new domain, the domain of actions. Now, this is an aside, but it's another important point, because I said the myth of the isolated act. When we talk in psychology about acting, we typically are thinking of, oh, there are a series of conditions, environmental conditions and individual conditions, such as motivations, intentions, skills, you know, goals, fears, whatever, emotions. And we have the affordances, the solicitations of environment, the environmental risks, and so on. They all come together, and we are acting in this scheme, and that changes the situation into a new one. Well, I think it's the more relational and processual view that we are proposing is different. We have a series of relations, intensities, potentials, things that can happen, things that are tendencies about what might happen or not. And when they come together into a particular relation between a scheme of the body and the world. So that they come together, the world is also, if you like, enacted at that point, by giving it the meaning that corresponds to that action. Of course, I'm not saying that the world is created at that point. It's just saying that the world, you know, something becomes meaningful in the particular way that it's, say, a tool is used in a different way, for instance. And this leads to another new situation where things are, again, less concrete, more open. And I'm using some dynamical systems. Forget about that. We don't need to go into that. That is the act. So because of this, there is a dynamic of sedimentation about our actions. We leave traces in the world. So, you know, what we do leaves some traces. And these traces can form structures, like in the case of a path in the wood. So what we have is a constant dynamic of, if I call it sedimentation and spontaneity. I like this picture of a river delta because it's very colorful. But you see that there are structures at different scales, and not just size, not just spatial scales, but different scales of stability. Islands that are more stable, others that are more fluid, things that are changing daily, and the actual flow of water. This is, I think, a nice metaphor for the kind of picture I'm trying to paint. Another way to put it is that we typically think of these structures as separated, like you have the scale of development, or the scale of evolution, the scale of development, the learning, the scale of learning, and the actual behavior. But you know, studies show that particularly in skillful behavior, all these scales tend to correlate. There are studies in the so-called pink noise, or 1/f noise, that show long-term correlations. So what's happening at the order of microseconds connects to what happens at the order of seconds, connects to what's happening at the order of minutes in skillful behavior, not all the time. And this is shown also in brain dynamics. When you do this, you know, these dual scannings, these hyper scanning studies, when you're doing an EEG directly at the same time of two people interacting, or interacting via some screen, doesn't matter. And then you compare the correlations across the individual brains. And what they find is that there are all kinds of synchronicity at different moments in the interaction at different timescales. So you have the alpha timescale is kind of 1/10 of a second or so. You could call it similar to the actual scale of behavior. You can say that, you know, things are happening at that scale. So it's not that surprising that there is a correlation at that scale. But then it goes up to down to the gamma scale, which is, I don't know, like what is it? 10 milliseconds or something like this. Much faster correlations that are hard to explain. It's because, as I said, all the scales end up if you like, aligning in some sort of cross correlation across different time scales. So our picture is more like this. And this, things are happening all the time. Development is happening all the time. Learning is happening all the time. And many of these things have their own norms, their own circularities, and they're all, you know, and of course it gets more complex in the case of human beings in the social. Why I like to put it is this famous phrase by William Faulkner, you know, the past is never dead, is not even past. It's still happening. So to try to bring to a conclusion of this part and before the last part, okay. So we have this self-sustaining precarious sensorimotor schemes. We talk about habits. We have agency. The requirements of agency are the different manifestation, which is the relations between sensorimotor schemes. An implication is that we have sensorimotor bodies, and they're not exactly coincidental with our organic bodies. That is why we can adopt, you know, I can do things to my body. I don't know, I can tend to a wound or something like this. I am acting on my body, on my organic body. So they're not the same. Sensorimotor bodies are these enactments that are made by these enacted social material networks of practices. Yes, and the processes at all scales are ongoing. So we had that thing about the, oh, you must have an agent before it interacts. No, in fact, the two are mutually influencing each other. Okay, that's what we left it. But what I just said would have sound more like, oh, once you're interacting, you start making yourself. You start constituting itself. I think the overall picture is something that you cannot separate constitution and interaction in this way. That's the message here. So bodies are enacted. Moreover, they're enacted together. We're not on our own here. And I bring here my the work with my colleague Hannah de Jager on participatory sense making. Briefly, we had that picture of an agent. It was an isolated agent, but of course we can have interactions with many agents, and all of them regulating the conditions to the environment and to the other agents. When this is happening, the interactive dynamic itself acquires a life of its own. The example we typically give is when you're walking down a narrow corridor and you meet another person walking the other way, and you try to get past the other person, and sometimes it happens that you end up doing this sideways dance for a while, left, right, because you don't know which one. That's an interaction, because it's regulating and coordinating our movements, despite the fact that we actually want to get out of it. So the interaction has an autonomy of its own. It's not always controlled by the interactors. And relational patterns that acquire certain, unhealthy relations that sometimes have that feature, that they just go this way despite the best intentions of all the participants. So we took that idea, which is already, I'm saying it very quickly, and said, does this allow us to say anything about language? So with Hannah and with Elena Kufari, we worked on what might be possible to say from all this embodied perspective, this organic, sensorimotor, and social interaction perspective about language. To actually tell you the story would be a whole different talk, but I will just give you a little flash there. We propose a model. It's a dialectical model in a strict sense. The method is dialectical. We start at the top with participatory sense making. And each of these concepts is developed, it's first proposed as a very abstract concept, the concept of making sense in an interactive situation. That's a very abstract. It can entail all kinds of interactions, asymmetrical interactions, friendly interactions, antagonistic interactions. We're not giving any concreteness there, but we already can see that if I said that the interactive dynamics can acquire a life of its own, there's going to be a kind of conflict potentially between the individual normativity of the embodied sensorimotor agents and the interactive dynamics. Sometimes I may just do something that, for me, makes total sense, such as when I'm talking to you face to face, I look behind you because I see somebody walking. And because of the way I do it and the timing, maybe you were saying something important to me, it can look like I'm not paying attention. And then something that was interactive feeds back into the meaning of our interaction. So that we say that there is a tension there between individual norms and interactive norms. And I cannot regulate that tension on my own because I cannot orchestrate interaction, say, now pay attention to me only and nothing else. I can't do that. So otherwise it would cease to be a real social interaction. So we need to find a way to bring this together, this problem, solve it together. And that's the idea of co-regulating via social acts. And so on, and so on, and so on, all the way to dialogue. But to give you an idea of what this co-regulation might be, like a first step, I can try to direct you to together saying, oh, we got distracted. Let's, with a gesture, let's continue with our conversation. Assuming for a moment I'm not really using language, and maybe like a gesture. Yeah, well, eventually, these attempts become settled in the sensorimotor schemes that I talked about before, and they become partial acts. They become acts that we do together, like a half of a handshake is a partial act. It's an act that I cannot complete by myself. Or if I give you something, I offer you a present, the act must be complete by the other person. You have to accept it. Otherwise, if I put it in your hands, it's not that act, it's something else. So that's the case of a social act. And with these, we can bring some way of regulating those changes in interaction. But each of these brings their own tension, their own internal tensions that are, you know, you analyze them and you realize you have all these problems here. And then you say, well, what happens in the empirical world? And this is how you resolve that tension. And in that sense, it's a dialectical model. But you end up introducing things like dialogues, participation genres, reported utterances, and so on and so forth. But you end up in a tension that we never really resolve, which is the tension between the incorporation and incarnation of utterances. And I will say what that means, I think, just to give you a flavor. But the whole view of language that is emerging here is one that is very deeply connected with everything else we do in our activities and with the history of our community. We have in this here Mikhail Bakhtin and Voloshinov there as precursors of this idea of dialogicality, that we are constantly braiding our utterances together into what they call a living stream of language. So language is one of those things that is never past. It's past, but it's still never past. And further things are developed in the book, such as the possibility through dialogue to develop critical attitudes, the attitude to say, I will not accept that norm, or I will try to engage in a struggle against this way of doing things. But I can't go into that. But to give you an idea of that braiding, here's an example from the work of Charles Goodwin, who talks about cooperative action. Cooperative, not cooperation, but operating together. And this is an example of syntax in dialogue, like two kids fighting in the street, say, one, why don't you get out of my yard? And the others, why don't you make me get out of the yard? You see how the syntax is reused. It's connected. The response is simply a modification on the previous utterance. And so in our dialogues, these utterances are all connected, and it's very hard to really say anything original, to be honest. The fact that we speak in a particular language that exists already is because we are braiding our actions to that already existing stream. And then, of course, this can be taken the form of other forms of actions, like making tools and reusing, actions and so on. So this incorporation, incarnation, well, the thing is like this. Are we talking about a new kind of agency when we talk about linguistic bodies? Well, in a way, yes. But I am using these utterances, and I didn't really explain how we conceive of utterances, but these utterances are moves in dialogical processes, and they have certain properties. They have the properties of helping constitute a personhood. By addressing you, I am kind of buttressing your process of self-constitution by recognizing you as a person. So in reported utterances, utterances about utterances, I can incorporate utterances in that stream of language, like in that case of the two kids talking. So this is an incorporation. I'm using these utterances that are already there. But in doing so, I'm also manifesting a little bit of that agency that was left behind at utterances, like a ghost, a little bit like something that was in that way of speaking. And this is typically when somebody says, this is not something you would say. This is more something like your father would say, or your brother would say. So that is the incarnation. So this is the paradox of human language. Our agency is constituted, linguistic agency is constituted through the appropriation of ways of speaking. But in doing so, we are incarnating a history that is in that way of speaking. And sometimes we may not be saying what we mean or meaning what we say because the language is speaking through us. So that's one of those dialectical tensions that is not resolved, which is navigated, which has lived with it. So instead of having this sensorimotor agent like this, we have a linguistic agent that is like a displaced agent that is constantly also reflecting. The origin of reflection comes with this idea of being able to look at me as somebody who's looked at by others. And so, for instance, certain decisions, going on a diet is a linguistic act, because the sensorimotor body doesn't want to go on a diet. It's me, through incorporating other norms and injunctions from whatever things they tell me I should do or not do, whether I accept them or not, I decide that this is what I need to do. And therefore I try to exert some self-control on myself, on my sensorimotor bodies, on my habits, and so on. And in sociology, this is not unknown. You know, the presentation of self in everyday life by Goffman is like, we're always performing, we're always acting. I'm conscious of the time, so I'm going to come to the close. I'm going to skip a couple of these, but the point is that because of this historicity and because of this complexity and variability, our conclusion is that there are billions of different human bodies. Each body is a history. Yes, we can draw connections, similarities, and science must do that, but it's important to remember that each body is different. And just to round up my conclusions is that we're also entangled with the rest of the world. Like I said, this is each of our acts has consequences for the rest of the world. And so there are complex entanglements and feedbacks from technologies of making marks on bones to cognitive tasks such as making lists to interactive tasks such as, you know, going on a list by pointing to your fingers, by gesturing to your fingers about the points you want to make, or particular ways of pictorial representations and the way we actually see the world. You know, something cultural becomes something physiological, neurological. I love this one. You got, you know, mathematics, technologies such as the abacus, and these kids who are counting with their fingers, and so that you can see their thinking process there, and it's amazing. And in a way, it tells you that this is coming from history, this is coming from a technology, the abacus technology, and yet it's been incorporated into a skill, a mathematical skill. Okay, so to round up, just to mention that there are things that have been developing towards ethics, epistemology, and ideas of becoming. So we have presented a non-reductionist, non-representationalist relational ontology to define, not metaphorically or evocatively, a concept of agency. And we have a dialectical materialist and world-involving conception of agency. The world is always connected in these sensorimotor schemes to making me the agent. And the diversity that we see, particularly with linguistic bodies in human agency, is part of what the theory entails. It's not an accident. It's not just we happen to have the very different ways of life. It's part of becoming a linguistic body that you will become different. And our becoming is unfinished. And I haven't said much about that, but anyway, that is the conclusion that we are, if you like, our bodies are both individual agents and at the same time necessarily achievements of a community and an ecology that surrounds us. So we are always, we're not one in spite of the other. We are one because of the other. That's the point. So thank you. I will stop there.
Very
Thank you
nice.
so much.
Um, yes, indeed.
Okay. I will stop sharing the screen.
That was extraordinarily rich, as what I had expected. The richness of it, for me, expresses so much of what I personally find useful and helpful and admire about the enactivist approach. So thank you very much. Would like to go to some questions or comments. How would you like to do it? Would you like to call on people, or would you like me to call on people, Ezequiel?
Maybe you call on people, you know them.
I will call on them.
Yes.
If you would like to put comments or questions in the chat, that would be great. Otherwise, if you could raise your hands or do your little yellow button, what have you. If you don't mind, I'd like to take the liberty of asking the first question, if you'd be so kind. Again, I found this to be very, very rich. It really reflects what I appreciate so much about enactivism. There has always been one issue that has troubled me, and it troubled me today as well. You talk about autonomy. I'm sure you've heard this before. You talk about the idea of autonomy, that the autonomous system. Yet at the same time, you talk about mutual regulation, mutual incorporation, and so forth. And I can't get my hands around that. You've got agency. Agency is a very good idea, it seems to me. But the idea that I'm wondering if there's another term, because one cannot simultaneously, it seems to me, be autonomous and at the same time be mutually constituting. To be sure, there is something agentic about us. I wonder if a term like relational autonomy or relational agency, I remember many years ago with Ted Sarbin, I was talking with him about the concept of reinforcement and how I thought that was just a horrible concept because it didn't talk about the meaning of et cetera. And he said, well, the problems go away if you say social reinforcement. I kind of liked that. I wonder if the problems of autonomy, if you see any here, go away if we say something like relational autonomy. But I leave it to you.
Yeah, sure. Well, okay, so we have historical reasons why we select some terms. Varela wrote a book in the 70s called Principles of Biological Autonomy. If you like, a little bit of that history has to do with actually bringing the organism back to biology. That was a big problem, and sometimes you could say it still is, but not in all parts of biology. So they wanted to say that, biology is not just chemical reactions happening here, happening there, but that there was an entity called the organism, and that organism had a sort of say in what was happening, just to put it metaphorically. They put it also in systemic terms. That was a structure-determined system, blah, blah, blah. And it was self-producing. And Varela used the word autonomy, meaning that what was happening to that organism is not, it depends on that organism. It's not determined entirely by that organism. That's what the problem is, or the confusion might be. dependence versus determination. So we're not talking about autonomy as I am this Kantian sense that fully determined. No, that isn't. So you might practice different semantic shifts. You might put it relational autonomy, and maybe that sorts it for you, or you might just shift the connotation of determination from one of dependence. Or so far we've been trying to keep the word autonomy with the paradoxical implications, because all the rest of the message is saying that we're so codependent and everything. Because the point is to navigate this difficult landscape of attractors that as soon as you say relational, boom, everybody starts saying, what about the individual? What happened to the person? And as soon as you say, ooh, it's self-constituted, oh, well, surely you mean, we had those reactions through history. We had that, when the participatory sense-making papers, it was responded to by other people saying, well, what about social norms? You didn't mention those. No, but they're not excluded in this particular paper, and probably we take them up later in other work. So we inherit this language, and we have, I don't know, maybe we had to use it sometimes in uncomfortable ways, provided that the tension that is created is sort of leads somewhere, leads us to say that, well, perhaps autonomous doesn't really mean disconnected from the rest of the world. Doesn't really, in fact, autonomy can only happen through connection. But it does say something that individual is, in a way, setting some of its own goals, some of its own norms and decisions within that context of the possibilities and norms of the world and society. So it does bring the individual into the picture a little. We have to, it's a difficult landscape, and sometimes it may be solved by the way you just said. If somebody says, oh, but if you say just relational autonomy, I'm happy with it, well, great, but that works fine.
Terrific. Thank you.
Let's see
Right.
if there's
Others.
someone else coming in.
Mike, could I ask a question?
Absolutely, ma'am.
I might be wrong about this, but I've always thought of it autonomy in terms of a continuation. It's not individual or relational, but there's an autonomy. It's a wider system than that. So autonomy within the organism maintains the organism's ability to interact with the external environment. So the autonomy, in a sense, is a continuous flow between the two. And the self-maintaining systems are in themselves operationally closed systems, working with one another.
Yes, indeed. I mean, it is, as you say, it's a very dynamical idea of autonomy. It's not this just a set of conditions, but it's a flowing concept that, because of all these underlying processes, are all dynamic. Now, we have to be careful. It's not like the autonomy is within the organism. It is how the organism is realized in its environment. It cannot be divorced from its environment. If you remember that diagram with the yellow blobs, there were arrows coming from the outside into meaning explicitly an enabling relation, saying, hey, if you remove that arrow, that organism might die. So there are, if you remove the sunlight, the plants will not make photosynthesis or whatever. So that is an enabling relation to the environment and to the rest. But it is that systemic closure that says, oh, but this little bit of the world that we're looking at the moment, that is an autonomous system, because it fulfills this relation of self-sustaining, enabling network. So there is dependence, but there is a mutual relation that if you were to remove this topology, those processes would just simply disappear, would no longer, because they are precarious. That was the point that I went a bit quickly. over. So that's the sense of autonomy that we're talking about. Is autonomy through relation? Yeah. If people are happy calling relational autonomy, I have no problems with that. It's fine.
Does the autonomy not constitute the relation in itself?
Well,
I know we're getting into the real nitty gritty here, but I'm thinking in terms of construal,
yeah,
because our autonomy and our interaction with the environment is how we construe meaning.
yes,
We're
yes,
participating continuously in autonomy, in sort of interactional autonomous relationships with ourselves and with the environment, and we construe meaning around that. We then apply the linguistics to it, which provides us, or the environment is applying the linguistics to it. So
yes, I think
there's I can't see autonomy as only relational and or enabling. I can't see it as more as anything other than constituting of the environment in relation to you, and you in relation to your environment.
okay, fine, but I don't see the tension there, because it's constituting. It's fine, and because it's constituting of the relation, it is relational, meaning that it will be very hard for somebody to answer the question, what came first, in an empirical case. I don't
think it matters.
Yeah, and it wouldn't even matter, exactly.
No.
Once you have this ongoing connection, circularities, this is what you need to understand. And then what could go into the philosophical question of whether you could have the autonomy and the relation then it's constituted. I think the autonomy emerges out of complex relations that exist in the world, and they, life.
Yeah.
But yeah.
Sorry.
Yeah, I just want to say just how overwhelmingly rich and wonderful the presentation was, first of all, and I'm sure probably most of us couldn't follow every bit, but the general spirit of it comes over so well. And I find it very validating of my own project, where I've wanted within personal construct theory to integrate the relational and the personal. I was looking at the video again recently, Peter, of when you interviewed myself and David, my co-author, and you said, well, why personal and relational? And in a way, I see that as being validated by, at a more sort of universal level, including biological process as well.
Yeah.
And I think in a way, Kelly sort of resolved this at a more logic, the sort of underlying logic of the approach is when he said that freedom and determinism are two sides of the same coin. So whenever I make a choice, I'm making a choice in Kellian terms between two alternatives, or I'm moving along a channel, which he calls a construct. But I'm also simultaneously constrained by that channel at any point in time. I mean, then of course my autonomy is going to start saying, well, this channel isn't good enough, and so I'm going to want to critique it and cut across it and find some new constructs that do better. But at any point in time, you could say that I'm simultaneously free and determined.
Yeah, that makes perfect sense to me too. Yeah, it's very much. I can see the resonances with things I've been saying here, and that's how I would see it. Yeah, too.
Thank you.
There is, as I said, there is this slogan of laying down the path and walking. That's
lovely.
That is meant to say that your activity is also a path-making activity, but it doesn't mean that the path is just anything. It's like, in fact, there are paths already out there, and most of the time you just follow the path. And but your walking is sort of maybe reinforcing that path or changing it a little.
Yeah.
And I love there are studies about the spontaneous formation of paths on the grass on campuses. They let people walk and then they trace the path between the buildings and so on, because they spontaneously show what people do. So they're constructed by the activity of people. And that's an interesting metaphor to me for about what you were just saying. Yeah.
And that captures the sort of community of people making a path.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, precisely. Yeah.
Robert?
Robbie,
sorry.
Thank you very much. Really interesting. And I just ask, at the human level, where would you differ from, say, Terence Deacon, his work? I don't know. I think you're familiar with his, and yeah. Well, I'll leave it at that.
Okay. The word, I imagine you probably mean his book on incompleteness or something like this. I forget. About biology and
or his view of language and
the view on
how
language. Well, okay, so but they're two different things. I mean, one is his book on, how do you go there? I forget the name. On, as you like, the connection between life and mind, to put it quickly. And then there's a lot of overlap, I think, although he emphasizes the notion of the need or the lack. Something is lacking, and that puts me in movement in order to get it. I think that what we're proposing is that our relations of sense making to the world may sometimes have that particular property or that particular characterization, but not always. I mean, to make it the central definition of how you naturalize meaning may be too strong, but there are all kinds of connections, and in that sense. And concerning the view of language, geez, I read his book long ago when it came out. I don't remember so well, but I know that there was this evolutionary idea of a symbolic species that may be a story that is compatible with many of the things I've been saying. I just want to say that when I presented that model that I just presented very quickly, that's not a historical model. That's not a historical, or not meant to be a historical model. It's a conceptual model. You go from an abstract concept and you make it increasingly more concrete. It might be that some of the historical passages in that model, such as at some point we talk about the use of symbols and so on, might just fit very well with what he was saying back then. But I will have to actually go and reread the book. I forgot a good part of it, actually, to be honest. So I see some compatibilities for certain, yes.
Thank you.
Donald, his mic is not working, and he has put a question in the chat, which I will read. It seems to be an attempt at clarification. His question is it therefore that we have a degree of freedom or autonomy within a closed system, in parentheses, mind, community, or government? And if I may add to that, what is meant by, I don't understand what it means to speak of human or biological systems as closed systems, but I prefer that if you respond to.
Yeah, okay, so just to be clear, on the last point, I mean, they are open systems. The closure is in the logic of the relations between the processes that constitute that system, in that there isn't there isn't any part of the living system that is self-standing. It all depends on the rest of the organism. So the leaves of the trees get the energy for the trunk, the root system gets nutrients, and so on. So for each part is there because of the other parts. That's the Kantian idea of a closed organization. And the word closure comes from that mathematical systemic tradition. That's where it comes from, and it creates all kinds of confusion that we always have to say closure doesn't mean that it's disconnected or not open to the world and so on, or not dependent on the world. As I said, we work with the language we have, but in mathematics you have the idea of group theory. Closure is applied to that idea, which is the idea that if you have the integers and the addition as an operation, it always gives you another integer. so that you say, oh, it's closed under addition because you sum two numbers, two integer numbers, and you get another integer. You don't get a half, a fraction. So that is what closure means and comes from there. So we're not talking about separated or closed. Now the question is essentially, are we autonomous or free within constraints? And yes, of course, that's always the case. But actually, it's a bit more than that. What I'm trying to say is that we are free to the extent that we can sometimes be free all the time, or autonomous through the constraints. But much like what Harry was saying earlier, it is through my connections and my ability to sometimes engage in this asymmetric way with the world, what allows me to say, oh, okay, I have this problem over here and that problem over there. What if I orient something and then this same flows start to move in a different way and it's no longer a problem? Very much like that bird who's using the wind to stay on the spot. So it is through the regulation of these possibilities that I can sometimes be free. And sometimes when I'm not able to actually do it, no, I can't. We have to be careful not to use autonomy and freedom as synonyms here. They're two different things. Autonomy is a technical term of self-constitution, etc., etc. Freedom will be a different thing here, but more along the lines of that relation between the autonomy and the world. I don't know if I was super clear, but I hope it more or less gives you an idea of what I'm trying to say.
I think, Andre, you wanted to highlight the Leontief and Vygotsky activity psychology. Did you want to ask something about that? You're muted at the moment.
I don't think I can say too much now, but there are very similar points. Leontief also starts to discuss from the simplest organisms, but he speaks more about directedness as the idea of agency.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Just analogy.
Yes, we in linguistic bodies we do make some reference to Leontief and Vygotsky, also to Eval Ilyenkov, as that activity theory school, which for historical circumstances seems like a different school, but I am very much thinking this is a continuation of that way of thinking. Sometimes the emphasis and the language will change, but and maybe the direction of where we want to go, but it is there is a lineage there of ideas. So very much so, yes, I agree.
Thank you so very much. I want to be conscious of the time. It's our time is basically up, and so what I would like to do is to wrap it up. And I want to thank you again, Ezequiel, for coming. I think it was an extraordinarily rich talk, and I feel enlightened by it, and I feel as though that I appreciate your dignifying us with your presence, and we thank you. Harry, do you want to say something about next week at all, or the next
There's
time?
a couple of announcements I want to make. Again, thank you, Ezequiel, so much.
Thank you.
And I'm sure everybody would like to join me in that. Peter, who is on my screen just below Ezequiel, is going to talk in 2 weeks about construing of money. Very current topic, of course, as always. The other announcement I wanted to make was that the Padua Personal Construct Conference, I was asked by Sabrina, who was with us earlier, who's the chair of the organizing committee, to say that the deadline for submissions for abstracts is at the end of this month. They've extended it to the end, to the 28th. And we very much hope that people will attend that conference and that things will be safe enough by then in July. I did send out a notice as well, which has the website and all that on it. So please think about presenting at the conference. Okay.
Good. All right, good people. Thank you so much. Until next time, we will see you again.
Thank
Be
you.
well.
Bye-bye.
Cheers,
Bye.
everybody. Thanks for coming.
You stick around, Ezekiel, so we could just say goodbye to you again if you
Okay.
I appreciate that.
Thank you.
Good.
Oh, what?
Okay.
Baseball went again. He did that. We had to get him to stick around next time. Yeah. Thank you so much. We're so happy to have you.
Thank you. It was really a
Thank
really
you.
nice conversation. I really enjoyed it.
It was terrific, really, very rich. What I recognized. So your colleague, not Hannah,
Hannah, yeah.
the other one in the, what is her name?
And what's it, Elena Kufari.
Yeah, Kafari, yes. I have got to look her up. She's an hour away from me.
Oh, well. Yeah, okay.
That's craziness.
Get in
So,
touch. She's great. And we're trying to continue to develop some ideas. And
although I did have a question. When you put up the pictures of those two, is there a requirement that they look exactly alike?
I think I found those pictures by chance and I thought, oh, they fit. So.
It was perfect.
Yeah. It's true.
All right.
Okay, well, I hope you all have a good weekend. And,
Yes, likewise.
thanks again very much.
Okay, hope we
Thank you
get
very
there.
much, Ezekiel.
Yes. Okay.
Thank
Well,
you.
nice talking to you.
Okay, you be well.
Bye.
Bye-bye.
Bye. How are your fears?
My fears. It's funny. I have a different set of fears now.
22 people, not too bad.
Huh?
22 people's not too bad.
Yeah, I felt it was okay. I think his work is really top notch.
Oh, it's incredible.
At the
I mean,
same time, I don't
It
understand. why
resonates
somebody-
so much, doesn't it?
Yeah, I don't understand why somebody so smart lets it get away from him. You know, it's too many pieces, too many notes.
Oh, no. Well, we're both in that sort of situation ourselves, aren't we? Just trying to cover so much.
Yeah.
Had a wonderful conversation with Peter Edward this morning.
Good.
Feeding back into the semiosis group would be great.
What was the basic thrust?
Oh God, you're testing my memory there.
You don't have to.
It would take me 30 seconds to just bring back the topic. A lot of stuff, a bit like we just covered, you know. Yeah.
Okay.
He put a diagram up. I can remember that he put a diagram up, which no doubt you'll get to see, which uses 3 levels: anoesis, noesis, and autonoesis.
Yeah, I don't like esis, so I go with noesis.
So no noesis, you
No
mean?
noesis.
It's a real no esis.
When are we having this other thing? This semiotic thing? Because I'm not ready, man.
Don't worry. I mean, we did have a discussion about the group as well, and I sort of apologize for making it bigger, but I think Robbie will be a very good.
Oh yeah, I want him there.
Yeah, but I don't think we ought to add any more because it gets too unmanageable. It's just too much richness. But it is next Friday,
Next Friday, okay.
25th of February.
Okay, good.
So you're going to enlighten us on Piaget and
I can enlighten you. I
semiotics.
can enlighten you. Did you get the piece? Did you get Mikhail's comments on the Overton article? No?
No, I don't think so. What was that?
No, I wrote to him. I sent him the paper that I wrote with Kurt Fisher in 2015 on skill theory.
Oh, okay.
And he said he didn't quite know much about that, so he found a paper by Overton, and he commented extensively on it. And I guess I have to comment on his comments to him. But he's so fucking critical. He just gets
Yeah.
constantly, you know.
Yeah, yeah, but he's got something to add, hasn't he? He's got something to contribute.
Yeah, I do. I wish he'd calm down.
He's Finnish.
Oh, does that make a difference?
Absolutely. I don't believe in these stereotypes, but somebody said to me after I'd met Mikael about the Finns being rather like that, and I thought, oh yes, so it's true.
Yeah, my friend Eva, she's a pain in the ass. She does his critique. This isn't good. This isn't good. This isn't good. Fuck you.
Yeah. But it's all meant in a very constructive and friendly way.
Yeah.
I'm sure. Yeah.
How did you feel that?
So he smacked you over again, did he?
I'm sorry?
He smacked your wrist yet a second time.
Oh, he smacked Overton's wrist, not my wrist.
Oh, okay.
How did you feel that the Ezequiel talk was?
I really enjoyed it. I mean, I was worried at some points that it was a bit abstract for the likes of Cummins and that sort of type, but
yeah,
you know,
Yeah.
I don't think it'll do them any harm. I mean, you're quite, and it helps me to understand actually, you know, your whole project of bringing him into this. And your critique of getting a bit sick of Kellyan's going on about their little worlds, you know.
but I think he was too big. I think he brought in too much stuff. It was
Well, for our context, yeah, but I mean, from my personal, you know, it's an absolutely wonderful preparation for me to study his work more, you know, and to it's a map, isn't it?
Yeah,
It's a map of his work. But you know, I just get so overwhelmed. I mean, I keep going off at tangents in my philosophy studies, and a couple of days ago, you know, Peirce was talking about Berkeley, Bishop Berkeley, you know, and I thought, you know, I've never fully sort of cracked Berkeley. So then of course I spent 2 days going into Berkeley, you know, but it's worth it. You know, you visit it, you can't do it justice, but you've got a little bit more of the essence of what this person is speaking.
yeah.
And each of these figures has got, we had a lovely talk this morning with Peter about, Peter Edward, about how, who was he talking about? He was talking about a thinker and how it was all there at the beginning. And then through huge efforts of a career and a huge, you know, the inquiry, the pathway of inquiry over a lifetime. And there's something still there right at the beginning, you know, the aim of the whole thing, or the vision that we have of the world. Each of us has a different one, and each of us has something to contribute. And when you look back, you know, because he started to say, well, you've got to look at later Peirce and look at how he developed over that time. And I sort of agree with that, but I don't agree with it because it's all there. If we take Peirce as an example, he wrote a paper in 1877.
Oops, we're still
1868, the new list.
We're still recording.
It's all there in that
We're
first
still recording.
Sorry?
We're still recording.